Pietr once showed me an abandoned settlement he had found back in the day. Though we were roughly the same age, I was more of a city boy than him. He had always lived out in the less populated areas, and spent a lot of his childhood and teenage years exploring the forest. He rarely talked about his childhood, mainly because of his alcoholic father who beat him and his mother. But he trusted me, and sometimes opened up to me after a bottle or two. To him, exploring the forest was a way to escape his dysfunctional home, which is why he had a pretty good internal map of the place. We drove for a couple hours until we arrived at the settlement. It looked rotten and old as hell itself. Most of the buildings were made of wood that was ready to collapse at any second. Some were made of your typical, Soviet Russian concrete, and looked about as stable as our economy. Still, we chose to explore for a bit, just in case. After all, this place would have made an amazing base for poachers. The houses were empty, except for some damp furniture and a couple of stoves. The concrete structures, on the other hand, still had some interesting stuff lying around. We found some weird boxes of old dynamite, which led us to believe that this was an old mining town. Sure enough, there was a large quarry a few kilometers away, which we found sometime later. A lot of the stuff we found was too rusted to make out what it had once been. Everything else was just in a state of decay that made it seem pretty unsafe for us to fool around with too much. It's not uncommon to find old abandoned mining towns that were never put on a map, so we didn't really take a second to wonder why it had been abandoned. That is, until we spotted the goose-loving deer. Pietr anxiously nudged my shoulder and gestured to the right of us. There was a large stag watching us from behind one of the houses. The more we looked around, the more deer we noticed. There were maybe 10 or 12 of them, just observing us. They didn't seem threatened by us, but rather like they were making sure we were on our way out of there. We slowly approached our ATVs as these frackers just followed us silently, never blinking or making a sound. When we got to our ATVs we debated whether we should light them up or not, but we decided against it, because we didn't want a herd of bloodthirsty deer charging us. We just started driving away, counting ourselves lucky, seeing as they hadn't decided to mutilate us. I remember looking back, once we were 100 meters away or so, and seeing well over 20 deer standing there motionless. "Screw that!" Pietr shouted as we raced out of the area back to town. We never went back, but we often talked about it. He firmly believed that the deer had something to do with the settlement being abandoned. I'm not so sure, but I definitely don't think it's out of the question. Screw deer, and their mysterious deer ways. At this point, police knew of our various encounters. They didn't really believe us, but still respected us enough not to mock us. After all, we had retrieved quite a few bodies for them that had been yeeted to high hell by deer. That all changed when one of the officers, one of my friends, had gone missing. He had responded to a call about some kids who had claimed to have been stalked by a strange old man while they played in the forest. For some reason, he had gone alone to investigate. That was 16 hours ago, and nobody had heard from him since. Pietr and I helped with the search, since we both knew him quite well. Hours of searching yielded nothing. Then, someone found his handgun lying on the ground. It had been fired twice, but we couldn't find the bullet casings. One of the officers had brought a search dog. It took a few whiffs of the gun, and started darting off into the woods, obviously tracking something. We followed as best we could, but the dang thing was fast as frick, boys. Suddenly, the woods was filled with the sound of aggressive barking and whining. We arrived at the spot where the dog had gone, and found, big surprise, a frickin' deer. From one of its antlers hung the lifeless body of the officer. It had impaled him through his throat and out the mouth. It was so grotesque that I still get a lump in my throat when I think about it. He was my friend and that worthless deer had killed him. It stood completely still, its head weighed down by the officer. The dog whimpered and snarled at it, but didn't move an inch closer. One of the police officers shot at it, which caused us all to light it the heck up. Retrieving his body stands clear in my mind as one of the hardest things I'd ever done. After that incident, the officers always took our claim seriously. They even offered backup when we went on our excursions. I still wonder about that old man though, to be honest. Did the kids just imagine him? Pietr still insisted that something supernatural was manipulating the deer, making them aggressive and bat crap crazy. I still leaned more towards the theory that deer are just, by their nature, bat crap crazy. At one point we were checking out a potential poaching camp. When we arrived, we were greeted by two older men, who immediately started questioning us. We explained the situation to them, and asked them to step aside, so we could inspect their camp. It was a pretty standard camp, with some fresh kills and pelts. But the men seemed very nervous anyway, like they were hiding something. We started questioning them until they cracked. They admitted that they had shot and killed about 7 or 8 deer the previous night. But they hadn't retrieved any of their carcasses and simply fled the area. What kind of hunter kills an animal just to let it rot, huh? Why the heck did you do it? Pietr asked them with a sense of urgency in his voice. They explained that they had been sitting in a deer blind, waiting to take a decent shot at some unlucky deer. Then they spotted one that walked straight for them. When they aimed at it, they saw its eyes through their scopes. It was looking directly at them, but still just walking calmly towards them. That's when they heard a twig snap, and realized their blind was being surrounded. All of them had the same lifeless look in their eyes. None of them made a noise, or any sudden movements. When they had completely surrounded the blind, they started making some aggressive expressions, and began bellowing at the hunters. Their blind was raised about 3 meters off the ground, and supported by 4 wooden pillars. The deer started ramming the supports while they kept bellowing. The hunters were scared out of their minds, and just started shooting the deer one by one. They ran back to their camp after that and hadn't been out hunting since. They showed us the way to their blind, and surely enough, there were several deer carcasses lying at the base of it. There were visible markings on the supports that backed up their claim. They then asked us if they were gonna get in trouble for what they had done. We told them no, as long as they didn't do anything with the carcasses, we wouldn't press charges. Normally we would have made them pay a, quote, fee, but seeing as they had been through an encounter with the psycho deer, we sympathized with them. In fact, we thanked them for taking care of them for us, since they were a threat to the locals. We told them that if they ever encountered aggressive deer, they should put them down immediately. They looked a bit puzzled as we drove away. Never saw them again. This is going to be the last of my posts. It's gonna be a long one, but it will describe the incident that eventually led me to Europe. I thank all of you in advance for reading my ramblings, and I especially thank those of you who believe me. It all started when Pietr got a terrible idea. He suggested that we found a central point in the forest, perhaps near a lake, or anywhere deer were known to frequent. Then we would set up a blind, in one of the biggest trees there, and camp for a week or so, shooting any deer that seemed off. At first I called him a Dumbo, seeing as our job was to preserve wildlife rather than mow it down. To be honest, I was also terrified at the thought of spending an entire week or so, shooting any deer that seemed off. He called me a chicken and gave me an ultimatum: either you go with me, or I go out alone. I wasn't about to let my best friend go out there all by himself for a week. He probably knew that, and used it as bait. We drove to the local hardware store, and picked up the necessary equipment for our little project: screws, wooden planks, rope, etc., etc. Then we went shopping for other supplies, such as canned food and water. We loaded all our gear onto our ATVs and set off into the wilderness. I wondered why Pietr suddenly wanted us to do something rash and stupid, but figured he had just had enough. I didn't blame him. The weird thing though, was that we hadn't experienced anything unnatural for almost half a year up until that point. Part of me wondered if he actually wanted to seek it out for some reason. He never told me why he wanted to lead this retarded crusade against the deer, but I still went with him so that I could watch his back. We eventually found a pretty large lake, surrounded by big beautiful trees. It was early August, so we weren't in any danger of freezing to death while we slept. We started building our blind, which ended up being more of a wooden platform, 5 or 6 meters above the ground with a great view of the lake. By the time we were finished, the sun was setting. We had seen no sign of wildlife while we built our blind, but figured it was due to the amount of noise we made. Our plan had one huge flaw that we had failed to realize. Dang mosquitoes. We had no cover, and were placed right next to a gosh dang mosquito capital of mother frickin' Russia. We caught no sight of anything strange the first night, except for each other's swollen faces. At dawn the next day, we awoke to the sound of something splashing around in the water. We peeked over the edge of our blind, and saw a doe along with her 2 fawns. We observed them for about 15 minutes before determining they were pretty normal. Similar incidents happened every once in a while the first couple of days, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt relieved and wondered if they had migrated to some new place, planning on terrorizing some new rangers. But for some reason, Pietr seemed extremely tense, and would curse under his breath. "Hey, Pietr, what the heck is going on, man?" He looked at me with a hollow expression, and sat up beside me. He explained that he had been having nightmares about the deer. He felt that if he killed some of them, he could prove to himself that he had nothing to fear. The poor guy hadn't had a decent night's sleep in well over a month at that point. He almost started crying while he told me these things, which really showed me how close this guy was to the edge. I had to help him, so I stayed with him and kept a lookout while he took a nap. I hadn't told him anything, but I had actually been looking into how much it would cost to move away from Russia. I hadn't said anything, because I wasn't really planning anything. Besides, I didn't feel like I could just leave him behind. I kept an eye on our surroundings for several hours, and almost decided to just lay back and enjoy the view of the lake, when I heard something approaching our left. Out of the tree line stepped a lone stag. I waited a bit to see if it would behave strangely before I woke Pietr up. It bowed its head and motioned as if it had started drinking from the lake, even though it wasn't anywhere near the lake's shore. That was more than enough proof for me, and I slowly shook Pietr until he woke up. He instantly crawled to look over the edge, and looked at the deer, grinning with some sort of sadistic satisfaction. He aimed at it with his rifle, and fired. Direct hit to the chest. He let out a sigh of relief and began laughing. We had the sound of several animals walking around the tree line, but never saw one of them. This only fueled Pietr's paranoia. He was practically trembling with fear every time we heard something wander around in the tree line. Sometimes a deer would appear on the far side of the lake, but no matter how many times Pietr and I shot at it, we never hit it. At night, our main source of light was a lantern that ran on petroleum. Part of me always suspected that it was a horrible idea to use that in a blind made of dry wood. The 5th night of the crusade, peanut butter hit the fan. We kept spotting the eyes of several animals, but every time we looked through the scopes, there was nothing. It felt like they were toying with us. Pietr started firing shots into the air, trying to deter the creepy frickers from whatever they were doing. But of course, it didn't work. I picked up the lantern, and raised it higher, in order to illuminate the ground better. When I stand up, I get lightheaded, and fall over. I drop the lantern, which in turn becomes a hellfire inferno. We abandon everything, and just descend down our rope. Empty rifle was up there, along with most of my favorite gear. As we stood there in the night, the blazing blind illuminated a lot more than the lantern had. I still shudder at the thought. The largest flock of deer I had ever seen was standing in the tree line. All of their eyes were lit up by the fire, giving them a hellish appearance. Pietr is basically hyperventilating at this point, and makes a dash towards our ATVs. We hit ignition and get the frick out of there. We never looked to see if they were following the entire ride back. We just kept driving, and letting out cries of adrenaline mixed with actual terror. When we got back, Pietr just went home without saying a word. I went to my apartment and completely shut myself off from the rest of the world. Locked my door, closed the blinds, and turned off my dumb phone. I stayed that way for a couple of days. Then I got the sudden urge to go get a drink. I had already consumed every bottle of alcohol in my apartment, so I went to the bar that was located on my street. When I entered, I was met with worried looks from the people who knew me. "How are you doing?" the bartender asked me with a sympathetic tone. This surprised me, because none of them should have known the stuff Pietr and I had went through that past week. Could have been better. "Why?" I asked. "Well, after Pietr's accident, you just kind of disappeared for a little while," he said. "Pietr's accident?" What the heck had happened while I was in my apartment? My expression made the situation pretty clear. Oh crap, I thought you knew. Then he filled me in. Pietr had packed his bags, and rented some rundown car, with the intention of skipping town. He had taken off in a heavily intoxicated state, and had hit a tree at 120 kilometers per hour, 75 miles per hour. The car was totaled and Pietr had died on the spot. After a few moments of silence, I remember just standing up and walking out of there. I walked around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually I had found myself back at my apartment complex. I noticed a piece of paper hanging out of my mailbox. I began tearing up when I read it. My dear friend, I have decided to leave this place. I can no longer bear the shadow that looms over us. I hope you will come visit me someday. You have helped me through some horrible times, but this time you can't help me. If you decide to come over, you can find me at blank address. I cried for so long that it seemed like an eternity. Still tear up as I'm typing this. After about a month or so, I decided to move out of Russia and get a fresh start. I know I can never escape my past, or the nightmares that keep resurfacing, but I can put great distance between then and now. I still miss that crazy Russian every day, and I will never forget how amazing of a friend he was. I now live safely in the heart of a big city, far away from any forest. I sometimes go on drives through some of the more scenic woods, but it still feels so fake. European forests don't have the same raw feeling as Russian forests. I sometimes miss my old home. I just wish there wasn't an abundance of terrifying animals roaming the woods. I haven't experienced anything unnatural since I moved, and I have finally learned to sleep properly at night. I regularly speak to a psychiatrist about some of my experiences, and feel more in control of my fears now. Well, that's my story. Believe it, if you will, either way it is very real to me. And next time you get the chance, please raise a glass to Pietr. Honor his memory, and the man he was. Thanks to all of you for listening. I am going to take some time to mentally recover from telling that last one. It still hits hard. Have a good day, and stay the frick away from deer.